This just might be one of the most lifelike 124 scale RC truck builds on YouTube, top to bottom. Utilizing a plastic model kit from Revell and a custom 3D printed RC chassis, can this tiny Jeep not just look the part, but also go the distance? Well, let's find out. From start to finish, here's how I built this 1980 Jeep J10 pickup.
Notice the fantastic traction of Jeep four-wheel drive. Tank's doing well, too. Jeep truck has great ground clearance. Tank doesn't need any. Jeep truck's very maneuverable. The tank doesn't have to be. Plus, with a Jeep truck, you can pick up a date. With a tank, it's nearly impossible. Jeep truck, from the truck division of Jeep Corporation.
Hello everyone and welcome! If you've seen some of the recent videos that have been posted on this channel, you'll know that I've been working on some custom 3D printable parts that can be utilized for building a super scale RC 4x4. Sized at right around 1/24th to 1/25th scale, the idea here is to use these components for some plastic model to RC conversions, just like I've done many times prior with on-road vehicles. After some tinkering and plenty of trial and error, this is what I've got so far, a fully functional but far from perfect RC chassis. Features of this design include a front-mounted motor linked to a divorced transfer case with an offset front axle, not unlike what you'd find on many older real-world 4x4 vehicles. There's also functional leaf springs on all four corners, though certainly aided by those coil springs. Not features that you'll see on a ton of store-bought 124 scale RC crawlers, making this a bit of a unique platform. After the work I've put in so far, I'm to a point where I'm ready to get this chassis off the bench and onto the trails, and conduct some field research, literally. I don't really have expectations for this chassis beyond just a super scale, very mild trail truck, but of course it will be fun to see what this vehicle is capable of and what can be improved for future projects. Certainly an example of built not bought, and for a few of us crazy folks in the hobby, that's what it's all about. If you'd like to learn more about this chassis, I suggest checking out this prior video, which I will be linking to below in the description. I talked a bit more about the whole idea behind this design and go into more depth into some of the strengths and weaknesses of this platform, as well as potential future plans. This is currently the first and only prototype that I have of this chassis, with my goal right now being to put a nice body on top, do some driving, and basically see how well this chassis holds up. Now this video here will be more focused on building this Jeep body and mounting it to the chassis rather than the actual chassis itself. But assuming this thing doesn't prove to be a complete failure, you can certainly expect to see some videos in the future where I showcase the assembly process, but overall it's a pretty simple design with an N20 motor and gear assembly up front, sending power to a transfer case with some slightly sketchy 3D printed gears, with power continuing through some equally sketchy but nice and thin drive shafts, keeping things looking scale of course, with the axles being pretty much standard MA10s, with a few alterations made to spots such as making the front axle steer. Of course, that said, both some modifications to the chassis and the model kit will need to be made to get everything to fit. But without any further introductions, let's continue on and have a look at the model kit. After a trip to my local hobby shop, this is the model I picked up. The 1980 Jeep Poncho Ice Patrol from Revell. Of course there were some other great vehicles to choose from, but I chose this specific kit for a few reasons. For one, it's a little on the larger side, at least relatively compared to something like a Jeep CJ. That said though, I knew an SUV body would be the easiest since there's no pickup bed to deal with, but that won't be an issue with this project. The chassis sits plenty low enough for a full depth bed. Another reason I chose this vehicle is that the drivetrain and suspension on the real truck is almost identical to what I have here on this chassis. There's leaf springs on all four corners, and the transfer case is oriented similarly to what's present on this RC chassis. With a little work, that body should look right at home sitting on top. This here is the most recent issue of this kit from 2017, but the parts can trace their roots back to 1981, at least according to the timeline on ScaleMates. Clearly this kit has gone through a few changes since then, perhaps most obviously the inclusion of a snowmobile. It doesn't seem to be licensed, but I'm pretty sure it's a late 70s or early 80s Arctic cat. It's a really cool addition to the kit, and I certainly thought about making it RC as well. However, it appears it'll take some fairly involved tinkering and engineering to make that happen, so for this project I'm just going to build it up as a static model, which will look good as an accessory. While an older kit design, all of the parts are very well molded, and as expected from a modern day Revell kit, a great selection of decals are included. Emblems, gauges, radio, it's all there, and you even have options such as choosing the black or silver instrument panel and warm or cool colored tri-tone honcho graphics for both the body and the snowmobile. A great selection of decals. As expected, not a huge number of pieces, and a few areas such as the interior and under the hood don't contain a ton of detail. But honestly, that ended up working out pretty well for this project, because I just intended for this to be a relatively quick and simple build, so this more basic model kit that didn't involve gluing together 100 individual parts ended up being ideal for what I'm trying to accomplish here. Something maybe a bit unusual for this kit is that there's no chrome tree. Honestly though, sometimes chrome parts included in a plastic model kit don't have the most lifelike appearance, and I ended up going with a slightly weathered look with this truck with some dulled down chrome, so I don't mind at all just painting the chrome bumpers and grille. Of course, the body, being the most important part, especially for an RC build like this, looks great. Like I said, not the most detailed under the hood, but the exterior is what I'm really most concerned with, and it's really well molded and has some nice detail. As you can see, pretty much the entire body is molded in one piece. This actually ended up being pretty convenient for this project. However, I could see this truck not exactly being ideal if you wanted to do some customization. For example, you'd have to cut off the bed and custom build the back wall of the cab if you wanted to make something like a flatbed. Also, the rear louvered window, which I think looks pretty cool, is molded into that piece that forms the back wall of the cab. Although I guess you could cut off the louvers and make it look pretty good if you didn't want to have them in place. I'll be building this truck almost exactly as it's shown on the box, so as long as everything fits together well, it should be a simple and straightforward build. While conventional style, or even not so conventional style pickups might not be the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the Jeep brand, they sure have made some awesome trucks. No shortage of inspiration for some RC replicas here. The SJ-based pickups that were built between 1962 all the way to 1988 are certainly no exception. Sharing a platform and many styling elements with the equally, if not perhaps more iconic, SJ-based Wagoneers and Cherokees, the former of which would actually be produced for an even longer run all the way until 1991 with the same basic platform and styling. But who can blame them? These trucks look awesome. The iconic Gladiator name was used from 1962 to 1971, though AMC, who had recently acquired Jeep, dropped the name, referring to these as simply the J Series or just the Jeep pickup. A little unimaginative if you ask me, but I can't say we've really gotten particularly creative with any of our product names, so who am I to judge? From the very beginning, options such as four-wheel drive with either straight axles or an independent front suspension was offered, among other options such as dual rear wheels. While nothing out of the ordinary today, for 1962 that was pretty innovative. Maybe even a bit too ahead of its time, as the independent front suspension, while seemingly achieved positive reviews from contemporary sources like Motor Trend, it would prove neither to be particularly popular or without flaws, only seeing production for a few years. While the SJ platform's debut might have seen some impressive innovations, possibly what these trucks and SUVs are most remembered for is being somewhat of a throwback for buyers in the late 80s and very early 90s, best exemplified by the Grand Wagoneer. What you're looking at here is a 1991 model year vehicle, not 1971. Don't think for a second though that the last of these SJs were rusting away on dealer lots with no one interested in buying these dinosaurs. Quite the opposite in fact. The Grand Wagoneer remained desirable and sold well for what it was right until the very end, having acquired a cult following and being quite a profitable product. Low mileage, good condition examples have always held their value better than just about anything else on the road, particularly the 1989 to 1991 models, which were produced after Chrysler's acquisition of AMC, with this resulting in many minor functional and quality improvements to these final model years of the Grand Wagoneer. Unfortunately, the pickups wouldn't get quite the same send-off, as Chrysler axed production of the J Series after the acquisition, considering it unnecessary competition to their own trucks offered by Dodge, though by this point the platform underpinning their own full-size conventional pickups was getting a bit long in the tooth as well. The last pickup produced by Jeep would be phased out by the end of 1992, with the discontinuation of the Comanche, as apparently Chrysler at the time strictly saw Jeep as the SUV brand and Dodge as the truck brand. Both the Gladiator name and a pickup would return to the Jeep lineup, however, in 2020, built on the JT platform, sharing many of its styling elements with the JL Wrangler. This model kit here is of a 1980 model year Jeep J10 Honcho. Honcho was a sporty trim package offered between 1976 and 1983. Depending on the year, it included various interior and exterior enhancements. perhaps most notably a bed-mounted roll bar and some very groovy exterior graphics. Fortunately, Revell have perfectly replicated these Honcho enhancements in this model. As far as I can tell, the body, minus these Honcho accessories, is identical to what you'd see on a basic J10 work truck, so if you wanted to build it into a standard non-Honcho truck, just fill a few mounting holes and it's good to go. Just be aware, as I said before, both the cab and the bed are molded as one piece, so be prepared to do a little custom work if you wanted to remove the bed. With the model kit unboxed and all the parts looking good, it's time to get it to fit onto the RC chassis. You don't need any custom RC building experience to know that something isn't right here. The wheelbase is way too short. As I stated in the last video, I wanted to see how short I can make the wheelbase on this chassis for fitting smaller vehicles like a CJ Jeep. But this pickup is going to need a much longer wheelbase, which I measured at about 118 millimeters. With a few clicks and through the magic of 3D printing, I had a longer rear frame piece ready to install. Backing up slightly though, while this RC chassis was obviously far too short, it was also a bit too narrow, with the wheels being tucked too far inside the body to look right. This was an easy fix, as I just threaded a nut onto each axle to go between the wheel and the mounting surface to space each wheel out to be closer to the edge of the fenders. This is not a perfect solution, as spacing the front wheels out this far not only doesn't look the best, but also having them positioned further away from the pivot point on the knuckles is not ideal. The proper fix would be to use a wider axle, but obviously this solution here is a lot easier, so it's what I'll be going with for now. Already that's looking much better, but with this longer wheelbase, I needed a longer rear drive shaft. Again, just a few clicks and a few minutes of 3D printing, and this new drive shaft is ready to go in. That long skinny drive shaft isn't the strongest, but it's nice and scale looking. It'll be interesting to see how long it lasts. Hopefully I can get some miles out of it, but you never know till you try. One thing I do know right now is that this body is going to fit great. Almost like it was made to go on top of this chassis. Just a little cutting here and there, mostly around the front inner fenders, and that's all it needed to sit low enough and level. Is this going to be another project where all of the pieces seem to fall right into place? Well, not quite. Have a look at the interior tub. The current design of these frame rails are too high up, with the floor of the interior making contact with the frame before the body is sitting down all the way onto the chassis. There's two options here: either redesign the center section of the frame to sit lower, or just hack away at the interior. Look, maybe not the ideal choice here, but not every project has to be my magnum opus, and I'm just having fun with this build, and I don't need another project that sits on the bench for months on end. I've got plenty of those going already. Besides, these trucks were pretty prone to rust, so if anything, holes in the floor pans are properly replicating the real thing. Nothing a little Dremel action can't fix. Sure, I may have had to hack quite a bit away from the footwells, but look how nicely that transfer case fits in there. I scraped away a bit of material around it just to get as much clearance as possible, but no need to cut through the floor here. A really good illustration of why I try to make these parts as close to the size of the non-functional components that are included in these plastic model kits as possible. Something I'm thinking about is how I'm going to secure the body to the chassis. There's pretty much a perfect gap under the bed for a strip of Velcro. I simply cut it to the correct size and shape, then placed it onto one of the rear cross members. Of course, the advantage to using Velcro is that it allows for some adjustability on where exactly you position the body. You don't have to be super accurate when securing the Velcro in place like you do when using magnets or drilling holes for screws. Later, I'll use another small piece of Velcro to help secure the front half of the body, but with the truck this small, and being that it won't be seeing any rough driving, a couple small pieces of Velcro is all the body needs to be secured. A little more fine-tuning may be required later on, but what a great fitting body. Obviously quite a bit of hacking was required on the interior, but I can simply lay down some fabric to look like carpet, and it won't look that bad at all once everything is complete. With the majority of the parts that needed to be modified to fit the RC chassis ready to go, I can start putting this plastic model together. I carefully removed all of the parts from the tree that I'll be using. There were still a few parts that needed some modifications to be able to fit, like the seats. Aside from that, I did any necessary cutting, sanding, or trimming to remove imperfections present from the manufacturing process. Mold lines or scarring from where the parts were attached to the tree are imperfections present on just about any model kit, so taking the time to remove them will result in a better looking model in the end. Test fitting all of the parts is also a really good idea at this stage. It's better to find out now if any fine-tuning, such as enlarging mounting holes, is required than after everything is painted. Overall, this model kit is very well molded and easily goes together, making the build a lot more enjoyable. Of course, that doesn't mean there aren't occasional opportunities to make things look even better, such as drilling holes in the steering wheel to add a bit more detail. As I like to do with many of these kits, I carefully deepened all of the panel gaps to make them stand out. Overall, this is a relatively time-consuming and sometimes tedious step of the build, but it will result in a far better looking truck in the end. While it won't make sense to glue all of the parts in place until after they've been painted, I did go ahead and glue some of the parts in at this stage, such as the radiator, which, as you can see, needed a little trimming, but eventually fit perfectly around the steering servo. The back of the cab was another part that makes sense to glue in at this stage. While a good fitting part, I was able to sand the transition between the two pieces to look just about perfect. Up next came some of the accessories such as the roll bar and jerry cans. The tailgate on this kit can be lowered just like the real thing, however there isn't much to hold it up while driving. To prevent it from opening unintentionally, I installed 2 sets of magnets. While they might stand out a bit and not look great now, once they're painted they'll blend in much better. A little later on, I did essentially the same thing on the front of the body to keep the hood closed. Next, I located all of the parts for the snowmobile. Like the truck, all of the parts fit together well after cleaning them up and removing any imperfections. Again, it can take some time to test fit each part and sand away these imperfections, but it will pay off in the end with a better looking model. At this point, all of the parts are finally ready for paint. I'll switch gears temporarily and focus back on the chassis. While it was up and running and fully functional, as showcased in a prior video, there were still a few changes that I wanted to make to the electronics. As you can see, I've selected some small size components, including a DAS Micro ESC and receiver, which I've showcased on some prior projects. They'll be powered by a 1S LiPo battery, which will sit under the hood. Not much on offer in terms of performance, but their small size makes them easy to hide for the best scale appearance. I also chose a 300 RPM N20 motor, which ended up not quite having the torque that I wanted, but not too bad overall. I'll continue to experiment with different motors, not really concerned with having a high top speed, just something as smooth and torquey at low speeds as possible. And finally, I decided to upgrade the steering servo since the prior one burned out. I went with a higher power all-metal gear servo, which has so far proved to have plenty of power for this rig and certainly was a worthwhile upgrade. Of course, some tiny soldering was required to wire all of these components. I did my best to keep the wires as short and tidy as possible. With everything working and installed on the chassis, I decided to design and 3D print a small piece to hold the ESC and receiver that was made to look like a fuel tank, with it being located roughly where it would be on the real truck. While that part was printing, I removed the wheels so they could be painted. I actually prefer the look of these wheels over the ones included in the model kit, although as a keen observer may notice, these are 5-lug wheels, not 6-lug like they should be, but regardless, they were something that I already had on hand, and this truck is going to look great with these wheels installed. After all the electronics and faux fuel tank were installed, I splashed some matte black paint onto the chassis, later followed by some very simple weathering. Nothing special here, but it does help add to the overall look of the truck, keeping it looking super scale on both the top and bottom side. Like I said, the low down modulation and torque isn't ideal, but the truck is alive and ready for that Jeep body to be placed on top. After a quick wash, all the parts are ready for paint. Nothing special here, I just used some regular spray cans to paint each part. There were a few steps involved in getting the body painted. First, I sprayed the underside of the body black and the underside of the hood and tailgate body color. I also painted the hard to reach areas around the tailgate while these parts were still separate. I could then glue the rear of the bed and the tailgate into place with no worries about missing a spot while painting or messing up the paint while gluing this part into place. After that, I painted the exterior with the hood and tailgate installed. At this point, the paint on the interior pieces was dry, so I could put it together. A pretty straightforward process, first adding a few details with a pen and paint before adding the interior decals. I glued the dash and seats into place as normal, but I also added some black felt to the floor to cover the holes created while making room for the frame rails. The interior looks great from the top side, but I also painted the bottom of the seats matte black to better blend in with the rest of the undercarriage, and I added an additional piece of Velcro to help hold the body on. I continued by hand painting various details on the body, including things like the window louvers and trim, as well as the lights. These are the details that really help bring this truck to life. After that, I applied all of the water slide decals, and there's certainly no shortage of those on this rig, from the large tri-tone side graphics to various tiny emblems. And of course, I can't forget about applying the matching decals on the snowmobile as well. I did the best I could, and overall not too bad. I love the look of this blue paint with these blue honcho decals. To help protect them, I applied a clear coat. While that was drying, I continued detailing parts like the grille using a black wash to paint the lower sections. After installing the headlights using some clear drying glue, this part is going to look great on the finished vehicle, as will the roll bar after painting some of the final details. One part that wasn't included in the model kit was the rear view mirror, so I added my own, which was 3D printed. Also, I didn't notice this at the time, but that little blue sticker that I put on the windshield is actually for the snowmobile. I think it's either supposed to be a registration or trail pass decal. Fortunately, it's so small, it can pass as a vehicle inspection sticker or something similar, but a little FYI if you're building one of these model kits. With the clear coat on the snowmobile now dry, I once again added some final details using paints and pens. That's going to be a great little accessory to add to the truck once complete. I continued adding detail by building the engine to place under the hood. Since I already decided to use the engine compartment to house the battery, I wanted to make the engine piece removable so it could be in place when displaying the truck, but also be removed when I want to go driving. To accomplish this, I needed to hack away at the engine, so not only would it fit over top of the RC motor, but also it would be easily removable. It took plenty of trimming and test fits, but eventually this is what I ended up with. While I thought about adding a few magnets to the bottom to secure it to the metal RC motor, it seems like it can just sit in place without any need to create any sort of mount for it, so I figured how it is here is good enough. Those parts are now ready for paint. Understandably, the exhaust wasn't exactly a perfect fit for this RC chassis, but with a little cutting, I was able to get it to both fit and look decent enough. It's only making contact with the chassis in a few spots, so hopefully the super glue I applied will keep it securely in place. I made sure to orient it so that it won't come into contact with the rear axle. Later on, some painting and weathering helped it to blend right in with the rest of the chassis and added some nice detail to the underside of this truck. I sprayed all the engine parts, doing my best to find as close of a match to the AMC blue that the real engine would have as possible. I think I ended up getting something pretty close, as you'll see in just a bit. While that paint was drying though, I moved back to working on the body after giving the clear some time to dry. Unfortunately, I had some issues with the clear, particularly on the left side of the body. There's some cracking and wrinkling all over the place on this side. I suspect this was a result of applying the clear too heavy and too quickly. Since it only really happened on this side, I don't think this was a side effect of applying the clear coat too soon after the paint or decals, but I guess that is still a possibility. It's best practice to allow plenty of time between painting, applying the water slide decals, and applying the clear coat, but of course it's easy to be in a hurry for a simple project like this and want to speed things up. In my opinion, one of the real joys of building older vehicles, especially trucks, is you can get away with imperfections like this by just going with a patina look. Some of the bubbling, particularly along the seams of the bed and around the wheel arches, I don't mind because it actually looks like some rust is bubbling underneath the paint, and those are common areas for these trucks to have issues with rust. But still, I didn't want to leave the clear coat looking like this, so what I did was sand down some of the worst spots to get it as smooth as possible. I tried to get some shine back in the paint with some wax, which it looked alright, but I decided to just go with plan B and add some weathering to dull down the shininess of the paint and make it look like the truck has a bit of dirt, grime, and rust on the exterior. Nothing crazy here, not trying to make it look like it was fished out of the bottom of a lake, just a little bit of work with some pastels and a black wash to dull everything down and make the truck look a bit dirty. I also accentuated the panel gaps with the black wash as well. A perfect patina paint job really isn't the goal here, and hopefully the trails will help add a bit to the look of this truck. At this point though, I'm happy with how the body is looking, and I can start the final assembly by gluing the interior in place. The windshield just snapped right in, so it doesn't seem like any glue is required there, which is nice. I used some thick globs of shoe goo to help hold the interior in place. I added a little grime to the bumpers and the grille to help match the rest of the body before getting them installed. And of course, I can't forget about the license plates. I went ahead and assembled the snowmobile, making sure to use a clear drying glue for the windshield. An awesome little vehicle to display alongside the truck. I'm not really in any hurry for winter to come around here, however I do look forward to getting some nice pictures of this model once there's some snow on the ground, not unlike what's shown on the box art. It does look like I'll need to create some tiny tow straps if I want to haul around the snowmobile, as the bed is a bit too short to close the tailgate. Of course, the 2 jerry cans and the toolbox are nice additions to this kit. Earlier I applied a matte clear over top to help protect the decals, and then a bit of weathering with a black pastel, smearing it around to add a bit of grime. Not sure if anything's being implied with "it's a Jeep thing" written on the toolbox, but I have a feeling some tools will be necessary as I continue to work out the bugs on this highly detailed RC model. Next, it's time to install the side view mirrors. They fit nicely into place and look great, but there's a reason you don't tend to see large, detailed side view mirrors on RC vehicles, because they won't survive any rollovers. When you start adding this level of scale detail, you really have to start driving the truck as scale as it looks. After a little assembly work and weathering on the engine, it's ready to go in. Not necessarily the most detailed engine bay ever installed on an RC vehicle, but not bad, especially considering the small size. With the engine in, this truck is now complete. We can finally fire up this super detailed RC model, which ironically requires removing this engine piece and instead plugging in a battery. But regardless, let's have a look at the finished truck. And here it is, in all of its 1/24 scale glory. Overall, a pretty simple build, and although not without a few minor setbacks, in the end a very fun project, and I'm happy with the finished result. If your radio-controlled 4x4 isn't going to be very capable, it better at least be super scale looking and worthy of displaying on a shelf, and I think this certainly accomplishes that. I think this paint color and decal choice looks great on this truck. It's essentially just what was on the box art, but still very cool seeing it in person. Of course, the accessories that are included are a great addition, and I'm happy that Revell included them. Overall, a great model kit if you're not overly concerned about having the most amount of parts or detail in certain areas, just a good simple project that you can knock out relatively quickly and have some fun with. Like I said with some prior projects, having an RC model with a nice looking body is one thing. When you can start making the undercarriage look just to scale, that's next level. I think the undercarriage turned out looking great, especially considering it's basically just a result of some very simple paint and weathering. One thing that I think could improve the look of the undercarriage is if I could squeeze in some semblance of an oil pan and maybe a bit of the transmission to cover up that RC motor from the bottom. Unfortunately, that might be easier said than done since there's not a ton of room in that area, but maybe something to attempt on a future project. I like the idea that the battery can simply be accessed from under the hood, but the body can also be easily separated from the chassis, especially important since this vehicle is intended to be sort of a test bed for this work-in-progress RC 4x4 chassis, so it's important for the body to be easily removable to gain access to the chassis below. This Jeep J10 certainly looks good, but now it's time to take it out onto the trails and do some driving. So I know this truck looks good, but how well does it drive? Well, about as good as expected. Not exactly the most capable platform, and there's certainly a few things that need to be addressed, but overall, it's pretty cool just seeing this truck work. It was already limping a little from the very start due to one of the springs that transfers power from the inner axle to the outer one coming disconnected on the front axle prior to this drive. So right away I knew this truck would only have 3-wheel drive, which I hoped would be good enough to get some decent driving footage, but eventually the other spring broke, so it was down to just rear-wheel drive, which, as you could see, severely hinders this already not so capable rig. With that in mind, please pardon the quality of some of this driving footage, as we were a bit limited on what this truck could do, even more so than if this truck had 4-wheel drive. As expected, clearly some work is going to be needed to improve the reliability and durability of the drivetrain. I'm not ready to give up on the springs just yet, as I have a few more things I can try to increase the strength of those connections, and from there I can see if the weak link then becomes the transfer case or drive shafts. You can see the suspension and those front steering knuckles are pretty loose, with the body flopping and bouncing around quite a bit, even with most of this footage being slowed down to help enhance the lifelike appearance of the truck. Clearly some room for improvement there, but right now my top priority is beefing up the drivetrain to make sure this thing is running in four-wheel drive reliably, and then from there I can move on to working on the suspension. I think I'm going to step down to a slightly lower RPM N20 motor. This one here isn't terrible, but it's definitely lacking some torque, and the top speed is pretty slow anyways, so it's not like I'm going to be missing out on a ton of wheel speed, and honestly wheel speed with this drivetrain is just going to be kind of scary. I think having a lower top speed and more torque is going to be the way to go. But it's important to keep in mind that this truck was built to be a test bed, so it's no surprise that a few things still need work. But this has definitely been a huge motivation to get those bugs ironed out, because I absolutely love how scale this truck looks, and it's a totally different driving experience. You really have to choose your lines carefully. Or I guess less choose your lines carefully and just more avoiding obstacles, if that makes sense. Like I talked about in a prior video where I went into more detail about this chassis, you really have to match the environment that you're driving in to the truck that you're using. I think something that's going to make this truck way more enjoyable to drive is having it go along a ledge, sort of like what you see here. Ideally, I want to elevate the terrain that I'm driving the truck on, because if I'm driving this truck while standing up, like you would with most other RC vehicles, I don't have much perception of how large even these tiny rocks are relative to the truck. So either I need to do a lot of crouching to get more to this truck's level, or drive it along an elevated surface, sort of like looking at a model railroad, which is usually on an elevated table. So knowing that this truck works, well, at least for the most part, at least I know there's certainly potential here, I'm going to do a little extra hiking next time and take this truck out to some spots that are elevated. There's some places like this that will actually put the truck right around eye level even when standing up, so I don't have to crouch at all, and I think that's where this truck is going to be the most enjoyable to drive. But it's a whole different world and a different challenge driving something this small, because stuff that would not even seem like the slightest challenge to your typical 10 scale or even 24 scale crawler, or heck maybe even a trail truck, can present quite a challenge to this little Jeep. So like I said, it's a whole different experience with this thing, which can certainly be fun, but you also kind of have to be in the right mood for it. It's a test of patience both to build and to drive, but I certainly enjoy the challenge. I definitely see a lot of potential here once I iron out a few things on the chassis. This has certainly been a fun little project, and I hope you all enjoyed watching this J10 come to life, even if there are still a few little bugs here and there that need to be worked out. But I think there's certainly some potential here, and I look forward to working on this truck some more and seeing how good I can make it. I can't believe it's been over a month already, but I previously posted a full build video just like this one with a 1977 GMC General in 1/25th scale. If you like this video, I certainly recommend checking that one out. I had a ton of fun with that project as well, but one of the key differences between that project and this one is on the General, I'm very meticulous with the chassis design. The CTC01 chassis that we've created is designed to be an easy to 3D print, low-cost platform that just about anyone with the right tools and a bit of custom RC building knowledge can put together. With it, you can build a great, fully functional radio-controlled model of a semi-truck or other similar commercial vehicle, utilizing a 1/24th or 1/25th scale plastic model kit for all of the non-chassis parts, like the cab, engine, interior, and all of that. With this chassis here though, I'm far less meticulous about making it perfect, and it's just something I've been kind of slapping together bit by bit, more with the intentions of just making it work than creating a polished design that I intend to release publicly. It's made for a great duality between these projects, because when I get tired of going through and refining the CTC01 chassis and doing the extra steps of creating tutorials and illustrations so that others can easily assemble their own chassis, I can play around with this one here with nothing other than the goal of just trying to make it work. It's certainly been nice to have that balance, but also as a result of this chassis' very crude current state, it's not something that I want to release publicly in the form of STL files at this time. I would like to get it to that point in the future, and it's not as though we're necessarily trying to appeal to the lowest common denominator, if that makes sense, Make no mistake, these are custom-built one-off vehicles that require an array of tools and skills to successfully build. I'm well aware that these types of projects are not going to appeal to the majority of folks in the RC hobby. But even with that said, this here is a bit rough around the edges, even by those standards, and there's certainly a few things that I want to further develop before calling it good enough. Believe it or not, we do have some standards here at Make It RC, and of course I believe honesty is very important, so I do want to be clear that the STL files for this chassis that you saw in the video is not currently available, but if it's something you'd be interested in the future, make sure you're subscribed and stay tuned, and we'll see how well I can make it work. Of course, I do want to mention that we have a variety of other chassis and accessories available as STL files for 3D printing over on our Patreon, and there's no shortage of videos on this channel showing projects utilizing these components, such as another recent project, this 1985 Pontiac Trans Am. And also, speaking of Patreon, we've recently surpassed 1,000 members over there, which is absolutely unbelievable, and I want to give a huge thank you to both everyone over on our Patreon and to all of the members here on this channel. It's your support that allows me to invest more time into creating these videos, especially ones like this one which are over 40 minutes long, and I've spent way too long editing. But of course it is also a lot of fun, and I certainly hope you all enjoyed it. And of course you can get yourself access to some additional perks, such as the STL files I used for just about all these projects, but again, like I said, this one here needs a little more refinement. Seriously though, the support is unbelievable, and I'm really using this as an opportunity right now to invest some more time into creating more of these full build videos and some other interesting content we have in the works. Of course I do enjoy creating these videos as a hobby, but also your monetary support helps compensate the sometimes ludicrous amounts of time it takes to create these videos. I promise I'll go touch some grass after I'm finished wrapping this one up. Whether this video gets 10 views or 10,000 views, it doesn't matter to me. I'm literally making these videos for you, not the algorithm, not for sponsors. And I think that's a great situation to be in, and I certainly don't for a second take that for granted. Thank you all so much for the continued support. Your contributions truly make this content possible, but of course, as always, no pressure to contribute monetarily. Just the fact that so many of you watch and enjoy these videos means more than you know. Although a bit of an unconventional project, I still hope this video has provided you with some motivation and inspiration for your own projects, but that is going to be all for today's video. Once again, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.